Hey everyone, my name is Reggie, and as you can probably tell by the AirPods in my ears and the title of this video, I will be talking about audiobooks today. Even though the calendar and Starbucks will have you think it's autumn, it feels like summer, so I'm going to take off this because I'm already warm. So almost exactly 2 years ago today, I posted a video called The Books That Are Better as Audiobooks or something like that. Essentially, this video was all about books that I think were better consumed as audiobooks because I thought the audiobook brought something more to the table. So now, after 2 years, I finally have enough books to make another one of these. So the first book I have to talk to you about today is an obvious one. You've probably heard a lot about it, and that is Sadie by Courtney Summers. This is a book that just kind of took BookTube by storm last year. Sadie follows our main character, Sadie, who is going after the killer of her younger sister. Her younger sister, named Maddie, was kidnapped and murdered. This book is told in dual narratives and dual timelines. So our first timeline follows Sadie after Maddie has been murdered, and she is going after the person she believed murdered Maddie. And so it's from Sadie's perspective. The second is about a year after that, and it is a podcast, and it's following a reporter who's now reporting on Sadie's disappearance. It is playing into the true crime story, but it's also kind of an analysis of true crime stories and consumptions of media that are about people. But what makes this such a good audiobook, and not just a great book, is that those podcast episodes are produced through the audiobook. So it's an actual podcast. You can hear different people talking, papers like kind of shuffling in the background. It's like straight up produced, and it's so well done. It's so well executed. It really brings a whole life to the story. It brings so much more to the table than the book does. I truly can't imagine just sitting down and reading it now after listening to the audiobook. Next up, I have Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. This isn't like the script. This isn't the movie tie-in edition. This is the original OG version. However, the audiobook was recently released and narrated by Eddie Raymond. So while I hesitate giving J.K. Rowling any more money or credit for additional forays into the Harry Potter universe, I do think this one was well executed and well done, and love me some Eddie Raymond, love a Newt Scamander. I mean, especially if you like Fantastic Beasts franchise, I definitely think you'll really enjoy Newt's textbook narrated by Newt. It makes sense. It's cute. It's sweet. He does a very, very good job with that. I really think that this book reads like an encyclopedia. It's an interesting encyclopedia, especially if you like the Harry Potter world, but like it reads like an encyclopedia, but Eddie Raymond just brings such life and fun to it. Next up, we have The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, and this was actually narrated by Elizabeth Acevedo, which is great. This is the story of a young girl who is trying to find her voice. She lives in Brooklyn, and she is struggling with dealing with her parents and religion and boys and just finding her voice. And she discovers poetry, starts writing poetry, and really expressing herself, and it's just a beautiful story. It's told in verse, and that's what makes it such a good audiobook, I think, is that Elizabeth Acevedo, one, wrote it in verse, but also narrates it. So she knows how she wants this poem to kind of lead and talk and feel, and if the flow is just beautiful. I truly think if you read it, it physically, like, the words would still flow, but there's something magical about having Elizabeth Acevedo read it to you in the way it's intended. The story is brought so much life in the, like, syncope and the rhythm and the verse. Next up, I have Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. This is one that I also think is very similar to Sadie in that this is a book that has like a podcast element. When there are podcast elements, they are produced very well in podcasty and, you know, sound really great. They're not like as fully produced as Sadie. They're put together like a podcast in the sense of the story. So basically the story follows two main characters. One is a girl who is really into school. I guess into is the word because she's not like, she is interested in school, but she also has a like secret love of this internet podcast called University. She accidentally comes across the creator of University, and so they form a friendship and a bond, and it talks a lot about school and education and exploring yourself and your identity. So while the podcasts aren't well produced, like from a Sadie perspective, because Sadie was put out like a professional podcast within the realms of that story, in this story it is just a kid in his room putting together a podcast. So it like, if it still feels like a podcast, it just feels like a one-man podcast. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but I hope it does, because I really do think this audiobook was wonderful. I think the book is wonderful. I think if you just read the book, it'll be wonderful, but I do think it'll be brought to a different level if you listen to it as an audiobook, which is the case for all of these. Next up, we have The Test by Sylvia Neuville. If you watched my last Books That Are Better as Audiobooks recommendations video, you will have seen that Sylvia Neuville's other series is on this. This is a short story he released this year, and I loved it. This is basically about a guy who's taking an immigration test, and things are just not what they seem, I'll say. I can't tell you more because it's super spoilery, and also this is a short story, so I don't want to give too much away. There's this kind of raising tension, and like the way that voice acting is done. The voice actor who plays Idar is just so good. Like when something is stressing him out, he feels like he's out of breath. He seems like he's stressed. It doesn't seem like he's just sitting there reading a book. Like, he really has gotten into the character, and it's just so well acted that like brought the book to a whole new level. Really fascinated me. I love this short story. I think it's one of the best things I've read this year, and I will be listening to it again and again and again because I think it is just a solid audiobook. So good. But really what's so good about it is the actor who plays Idar is just so fantastic. Like, he is so fantastic. I can't express to you how good he is in this role, just because I mean, like, voice acting is acting, and you have to do so much with it, of course. But I don't think I've ever listened to a voice actor that I think really wasn't just voice acting, but was like just doing the most. Like, I imagine that if we had like a camera on this guy while he was reading, like, it would look like he was running around. Next up, I have Becoming by Michelle Obama. Of course, this was narrated by Michelle Obama, and it's just so good. I love memoirs that are just narrated by the person that's written them. I think there's something very special about when it can be done, a author narrating their book, especially in memoirs, because it brings a whole new life to it, and they can tell their story in their way and bring so much more to it. Of course, that's what Michelle Obama did. It felt like she was just sitting there telling you about her life instead of just reading her book to you. Next up, we have Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. So this is the story of a young boy whose brother was shot and killed. He takes an elevator ride down to kill the person who killed his brother. And so this is a story of the cycle of gun violence. Kind of got a like speculative fiction or a magical realism aspect to it. This is also told in verse. It goes by really quick. I think you could listen to this in like 2 hours. And this is also narrated by Jason Reynolds. So again, just like Elizabeth Acevedo's The Poet X, you really get those beats and those tempos and that syncopation the way it's intended, and it just brings a whole new life to the story. Again, I think if you just read it, you would get those beats, those syncopations, but there's so much more nuance and weight to them when Jason Reynolds reads it, and I think it's just beautifully done. I highly recommend this as an audiobook. It's so good. It's a great book. Like, if you can't read the audiobooks of any of these books, these are all amazing books, and I recommend you physically read them if you just can't do audiobooks. However, if you can do audiobooks, you have to listen to these audiobooks. These are the audiobooks you have to listen to because they're so good, and they make the books better than just reading them. Next up, we have Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. When I was making this list and going through the books I've read since the last one I put up, I was surprised that Born a Crime wasn't on the last one, because this was my favorite book of last year, and that was when I realized it was 2 years ago that I posted that video and not 1 year ago. But anyways, Born a Crime by Trevor Noah is amazing, and it's the memoir of comedian Trevor Noah. So basically, again, like with Michelle Obama's, I love reading memoirs narrated by the person who wrote them. What made his so great is there are moments in his book where he mentions different languages, or he writes in different languages. Hearing him actually pronounce those words, say those other languages, was fantastic. While his book is very serious in nature, if you don't know, Trevor Noah grew up in South Africa during the apartheids, so his very existence was a crime. He talks about some very harsh, hard, real realities he had to grow up with. However, he, in classic Trevor Noah fashion, does so through the lens of comedy, and so the way he reads also really impacts how you feel about the jokes he says, how the jokes land, how you understand his jokes when he's being serious. Like, it brings a lot to nuance to the story. I really love Trevor Noah's book, and it was very special to me. But I do think this is a book that a lot of people will enjoy, and I think the audiobook, like I said, makes it even better, so definitely check that out. I've actually been meaning to film this video for months and months and months, but there was one book that I knew once I read it, / listen to it would make this list. Hands down, 100% knew it would be on this list. So I just had to read it. And I finally read it, like, in July, I think. And that's Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is the oral history of a band, Daisy Jones and the Six, and it chronicles their rise to fame and their subsequent breakup. It's set in the 60s and 70s, so it's amidst sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so if any of those things are going to be triggering for you, heavy alcohol abuse, heavy drug use, infidelity, things like that, if those are going to be triggering for you, don't read this. However, it's so, so good. Love it a lot. It's fantastic. And like I said, I knew it was going to make this list, and it really did. Can't imagine reading this book physically. I don't think it would have the same punch, the same gusto, the same style if you read it physically. I do intend on reading it physically to just sit there and tab it, but I think your first read through has to be an audiobook. It's an oral history, right? So it's basically an interview and asking these different members of the cast their stories, and so you get different perspectives and things that might not be true, might be wrong, might be this, might be that, but you're getting their story. And so they're just telling it from their perspective for a page or two. You may get an interjection from the interviewer, but I don't think even that happens too often. So it's just like a block of someone talking to you for a bit. So it's nice when someone's like actually talking to you for a bit. I think that's just, the format just lends itself perfectly to an audiobook, and I think this book should be consumed as an audiobook. I think that's what Taylor Jenkins Reid intended when she, you know, wrote it, because she also casted the audiobook, and this full cast narration has some amazing audiobook narrators, including one of my all-time favorites, January Lavoie. So I feel like when she wrote this, she had in mind that audiobook had to be done well, and it was done well. It was produced beautifully. The full cast works so well, and it's a great book, but I can't imagine having just sat down and read it with my eyeballs. I think it has to be consumed audibly, auditorily, through your ears. You gotta listen to the audiobook. That is all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, you should go ahead and comment down below. Let me know if you've listened to any of these books, and you should also let me know any recommendations you have for books that you think lend themselves well to audiobook, and I would love your recommendations, so please do that. Thumbs up this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't already, all that fun stuff, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!